They were the most powerful weapons ever built, floating fortresses of steel and fire that could unleash destruction from 20 miles away. When the battleship HMS Hood exploded in the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941, it took just 3 minutes for Pride of the Royal Navy to vanish beneath the waves, taking all but 3 of its 1,418 crew with it. The German battleship Bismarck had just demonstrated what these Iron Giants were truly capable of, and in doing so changed the course of the Second World War. This is the story of how battleships, those magnificent yet vulnerable leviathans, dominated the Atlantic theater, shaped naval strategy, and ultimately revealed the changing face of modern warfare. The Atlantic Ocean in 1939 was about to become the world's most contested body of water. Stretching nearly 3,000 miles from the shores of North America to the coasts of Europe and Africa, this vast expanse would witness some of the most dramatic naval engagements in history. At the center of this struggle were the battleships, massive warships that had ruled the seas for decades, embodying national prestige and naval supremacy. These vessels, some displacing over 40,000 tons and mounting guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car, represented the pinnacle of industrial might and military engineering. As storm clouds gathered over Europe in the late 1930s, the great powers had invested enormous resources into these floating citadels, betting that they would prove decisive in the coming conflict. The battleship's lineage stretched back centuries, evolving from the ships of the line that had fought at Trafalgar and other great sailing battles. By the 20th century, these vessels had been transformed by technology into steel-hulled monsters, powered by oil-fired turbines and protected by armor plate up to 16 inches thick. The revolutionary HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, had rendered all previous battleships obsolete with its unprecedented combination of speed, protection, and all-big-gun armament. In the decades that followed, naval architects pushed the boundaries of what was possible, creating ever larger and more powerful designs. By the outbreak of World War II, battleships had reached an apex of development that would never be surpassed. Britain entered the war with the most powerful navy in the world, a fleet that reflected centuries of maritime tradition and global imperial reach. The Royal Navy's battleship force included modern vessels like HMS King George V and HMS Prince of Wales, as well as older ships like HMS Warspite and HMS Royal Oak that had been modernized between the wars. These ships were designed to project British power across the globe, protecting the vital sea lanes that connected Britain to its empire and ensuring that supplies could flow from North America and beyond. The Admiralty understood that Britain's survival depended entirely on its ability to maintain control of the Atlantic. Without access to imported food, fuel, and raw materials, the island nation would be strangled into submission. Germany, by contrast, possessed a much smaller fleet, but one that included some of the most formidable battleships ever built. The Kriegsmarine had begun an ambitious construction program in the late 1930s, producing powerful new vessels designed to challenge British naval supremacy. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, classified as battleships despite their relatively smaller main armament, combined heavy firepower with exceptional speed, making them deadly commerce raiders. More threatening still were the true heavy battleships, Bismarck and her sister ship Tirpitz. These magnificent vessels displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded and mounted 8 15-inch guns capable of penetrating the thickest armor at extreme ranges. They represented Germany's bid to break British control of the Atlantic and were viewed with a mixture of respect and dread by Allied naval planners. The German naval strategy in the Atlantic was fundamentally different from Britain's. While the Royal Navy sought to maintain control of the sea lanes and impose a blockade on Germany, the Kriegsmarine adopted a strategy of commerce raiding, designed to sever Britain's maritime lifelines. German surface raiders, including battleships, heavy cruisers, and armed merchant vessels, would venture into the Atlantic to attack convoys and sink merchant ships, forcing the British to disperse their naval forces to protect their far-flung trade routes. This strategy had proven effective in World War I, when German surface raiders and U-boats had come perilously close to starving Britain into defeat. Now, with even more powerful ships at their disposal, German naval commanders hoped to achieve what had eluded them a generation earlier. The first major battleship action of the Atlantic War came in December 1939, when the pocket battleship Graf Spee was cornered off the coast of Uruguay after a successful raiding cruise. Though technically a heavy cruiser rather than a true battleship, the Graf Spee had been designed to outgun anything fast enough to catch her and outrun anything powerful enough to destroy her. After sinking 9 merchant ships in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, she encountered 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, off the River Plate. The ensuing battle demonstrated both the power and limitations of surface raiders. Though the Graf Spee inflicted severe damage on HMS Exeter, forcing her to break off the engagement, the 2 lighter cruisers continued to harry the German ship, scoring hits that damaged its fuel system and killed dozens of crew members. Captain Hans Longsdorff withdrew into Montevideo harbor for repairs. But finding himself trapped by gathering British forces and believing incorrectly that overwhelming reinforcements were en route, he chose to scuttle his ship rather than risk her capture. The Battle of the River Plate was a propaganda victory for Britain, demonstrating that German surface raiders could be hunted down and defeated.
But the Graf Spee incident merely foreshadowed the much greater battleship contests to come. In the spring of 1940, battleships played a crucial role in the Norwegian campaign, when Germany invaded Norway to secure access to Swedish iron ore and establish naval and air bases along the Norwegian coast. The Royal Navy responded with force, deploying battleships and other heavy units to contest the invasion. On April 9th, HMS Renowned engaged the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in heavy seas off Norway, scoring hits on the Gneisenau before the German ships broke off and fled. Though inconclusive, this engagement demonstrated that the Royal Navy was willing to bring its battleships into contested waters to challenge German naval operations. The Norwegian campaign also revealed the vulnerability of battleships to air attack, a lesson that would become increasingly important as the war progressed. German aircraft attacked Allied naval forces repeatedly, sinking several destroyers and damaging other vessels. Yet battleships, with their heavy armor and robust construction, proved remarkably resilient to bombing. The lesson seemed to be that while battleships were vulnerable to air attack, they could absorb tremendous punishment and remain operational, unlike lighter vessels that could be sunk or crippled by single bomb hits. By the spring of 1941, the strategic situation in the Atlantic had become desperate for Britain. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening to cut Britain's transatlantic lifeline. The entry of German battleships into the Atlantic could make this crisis catastrophic. In January and February 1941, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sorted into the Atlantic on Operation Berlin, a highly successful commerce raiding cruise that saw them sink 22 merchant ships, totaling over 100,000 tons, while evading repeated attempts by the British to intercept them. The psychological impact of having German battleships loose in the Atlantic was immense. The Admiralty was forced to hold back convoys, reroute shipping, and deploy major naval forces to hunt the raiders, disrupting the entire convoy system. But these successes were merely the prelude to Germany's most ambitious surface operation of the war. In May 1941, the brand-new battleship Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, prepared to break out into the Atlantic on Operation Rheinübung. The objective was to wreak havoc among Allied convoys, sinking as many merchant ships as possible, while tying down British naval forces. The Bismarck was the most powerful warship Germany had ever built, and her captain, Ernst Lindemann, commanded a superbly trained crew aboard a vessel that represented the peak of German naval engineering. If the Bismarck could reach the Atlantic convoy routes, the results could be catastrophic. The British were determined to prevent this at all costs. Intelligence reports and reconnaissance aircraft tracked the German ships as they moved north through Norwegian waters toward the Denmark Strait, the passage between Iceland and Greenland that offered the most direct route to the Atlantic. The Admiralty deployed virtually every available heavy ship to intercept the Germans. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland took HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales north to guard the Denmark Strait, while other forces positioned themselves to cut off alternative routes. The stage was set for the most famous battleship duel of the war. HMS Hood was more than just a warship. She was a symbol of British naval power and imperial prestige. Launched in 1918, the Hood was the largest warship in the world for 2 decades, a graceful and yet formidable vessel that had shown the flag in ports around the globe during the interwar years. To the British public, the Hood was invincible. But naval architects knew that her armor protection was inadequate by modern standards, particularly her deck armor, which was vulnerable to plunging fire from long-range shells. The decision to send the Hood against the Bismarck was controversial, but the Admiralty had little choice. She was one of the few ships fast enough to intercept the German battleship and powerful enough to fight her. In the early morning hours of May 24, 1941, the British and German forces made contact in the Denmark Strait. The sea was rough, with heavy swells and poor visibility, but both sides had achieved radar contact and were maneuvering for advantage. Admiral Holland ordered his ships to close rapidly, hoping to reduce the range quickly and minimize the time his vessels would be exposed to German fire while unable to bring all their own guns to bear. It was a sound tactical decision, but one that would have tragic consequences. At approximately 5:52 a.m., the German ships opened fire. The Bismarck's third salvo struck HMS Hood with devastating effect. One or more 15-inch shells penetrated the Hood's thin deck armor and detonated in or near one of its ammunition magazines. The explosion was cataclysmic. A massive pillar of flame erupted from the Hood's center, reaching thousands of feet into the air. The mighty ship's back broke, and within 3 minutes, she had disappeared beneath the waves. Of her crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. The shock of the loss of the Hood reverberated throughout Britain and the world. The seemingly invincible symbol of British naval might had been destroyed in minutes. If the Bismarck could do that to the Hood, what might it do to merchant convoys?
The Prince of Wales continued to engage the German ships despite the Hood's destruction, but she was newly commissioned and still had civilian technicians aboard working out mechanical problems with her guns. After scoring several hits on the Bismarck, including one that ruptured a fuel tank and contaminated hundreds of tons of oil, the Prince of Wales was herself hit multiple times and forced to break off the engagement. The Battle of the Denmark Strait appeared to be a crushing German victory, but those hits on the Bismarck, seemingly minor at the time, would prove decisive. The loss of the Hood electrified the Admiralty and the British government. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a simple order: sink the Bismarck. Every available ship in the Atlantic was redirected to hunt down the German battleship. Aircraft from Britain and carriers at sea searched vast expanses of ocean. The Royal Navy was determined that the Bismarck would not reach the open Atlantic, regardless of the cost. For Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding the German squadron from the Bismarck's bridge, the situation was becoming precarious. The damage from the Prince of Wales's shells had reduced his ship's speed and fuel capacity. He made the fateful decision to detach the Prince Eugen to continue the raiding mission, while he took the Bismarck to the French port of Brest for repairs. For nearly 2 days, the Bismarck evaded her pursuers, disappearing into the vastness of the Atlantic. British commanders faced the nightmare scenario that she might escape entirely. But on May 26th,
A Royal Air Force Catalina flying boat spotted the German battleship, and the hunt was on again. That evening, Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from the carrier HMS Ark Royal attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire. One torpedo struck the Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudders and making her unsteerable. The mighty battleship could now only steam in circles, unable to maneuver or escape. Her fate was sealed. On the morning of May 27th, the British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, closed in for the kill. What followed was less a battle than an execution. The two British battleships hammered the Bismarck with hundreds of shells from ranges where the German ship could barely reply. Her guns were knocked out one by one, her superstructure was reduced to twisted metal, and fires raged throughout the ship. Yet still the Bismarck refused to sink. Her armored citadel, though pierced repeatedly, kept her afloat even as she was transformed into a burning hulk. Finally, with ammunition running low and the Bismarck still stubbornly floating, the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire fired torpedoes into the German ship's hull. At 10:40 a.m., the Bismarck rolled over and sank, taking Admiral Lütjens and most of her crew of over 2,000 men to the bottom. Only 110 survivors were rescued from the freezing waters. The destruction of the Bismarck marked a turning point in the Atlantic Naval War. Germany had lost her most powerful surface unit and would never again attempt to send battleships on extended raiding operations in the Atlantic. The psychological impact was enormous. The Royal Navy had demonstrated that no matter how powerful a German ship might be, it would be hunted down and destroyed. But the cost had been terrible. The loss of the Hood and the brutal hunt for the Bismarck revealed both the power and the limitations of battleships in modern naval warfare. These mighty vessels could deal devastating blows, but they were also vulnerable and required enormous resources to protect or destroy. The sister ship of the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, would spend most of her career hiding in Norwegian fjords, serving as a fleet in being that tied down enormous British naval and air resources simply by existing as a threat. The mere possibility that the Tirpitz might break out and attack Arctic convoys bound for the Soviet Union forced the Royal Navy to maintain powerful covering forces with every convoy operation. In July 1942, the threat of the Tirpitz led to one of the greatest disasters of the convoy war, when convoy PQ-17 was ordered to scatter in the face of an anticipated attack. The Tirpitz never actually engaged the convoy, but without the protection of their escorts, the scattered merchant ships were savaged by U-boats and aircraft, with 24 of 35 ships sunk. The Tirpitz had inflicted catastrophic damage without firing a shot. American battleships entered the Atlantic theater following the United States' entry into the war in December 1941. The U.S. Navy possessed powerful modern battleships like USS South Dakota and USS Massachusetts, as well as older vessels that were modernized for convoy escort and support duties. American battleships participated in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, where USS Massachusetts engaged and damaged the incomplete French battleship Jean Bart at Casablanca. This action demonstrated that even with air power becoming increasingly dominant, battleships still had a role in supporting amphibious operations and providing heavy naval gunfire support. The final major battleship action in the European theater came on December 26, 1943, when HMS Duke of York intercepted and sank the German battleship Scharnhorst off Norway's North Cape. The Scharnhorst had sorted to attack convoy JW-55B, bound for the Soviet Union, but British intelligence had anticipated the move, and Admiral Bruce Fraser positioned the Duke of York to intercept. In a running battle fought in Arctic darkness, the British battleship's superior radar fire control proved decisive. The Duke of York's 14-inch guns scored hits that slowed the Scharnhorst, allowing British cruisers and destroyers to close in and deliver the killing blow with torpedoes. The sinking of the Scharnhorst effectively ended German surface operations in the Atlantic. The Tirpitz, isolated in her Norwegian lair, would be destroyed by RAF bombers in November 1944, bringing the era of German battleship operations to a close.
Throughout the Atlantic campaign, battleships served multiple roles beyond their primary function as ship killers. They escorted vital convoys, their presence deterring surface attacks, and their heavy anti-aircraft batteries providing protection against air raids. They supported amphibious operations, their massive guns capable of obliterating coastal fortifications that smaller weapons could not touch. British and American battleships provided naval gunfire support for the D-Day landings in June 1944, their guns pounding German positions along the Normandy coast. HMS Warspite, the veteran battleship that had fought at Jutland in 1916, fired some of the first shots of the Normandy invasion, her 15-inch guns silencing German batteries that threatened the landing beaches. Yet even as battleships continued to perform valuable service, the war was demonstrating that the era of the battleship as the arbiter of naval power was coming to an end. The aircraft carrier had emerged as the new capital ship, capable of projecting power over hundreds of miles without ever bringing the carrier itself into danger. In the Pacific, where carrier battles dominated naval operations, this transition was even more dramatic. But in the Atlantic, where weather and operating conditions often limited air operations, battleships remained relevant throughout the war. The strategic impact of battleships on the Atlantic War cannot be overstated. The threat posed by powerful German surface raiders forced Britain to maintain substantial naval forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. Every time a German battleship or heavy cruiser put to sea, the Royal Navy had to respond with overwhelming force, diverting resources from convoy protection, amphibious operations, and other pressing needs. Conversely, British and American battleships provided the muscle that allowed Allied forces to operate with confidence in contested waters, knowing that they possessed ships capable of defeating any surface threat. The battleship also played a crucial psychological role in the Atlantic conflict. These massive vessels embodied national prestige and military might in a way that few other weapon systems could match. The loss of the Hood was a psychological blow to Britain that went far beyond the tactical significance of losing one ship. Similarly, the destruction of the Bismarck provided an enormous morale boost at a time when Britain desperately needed good news. The German decision to keep the Tirpitz in Norwegian waters rather than risk her in active operations reflected an understanding that the loss of such a prestigious vessel would be politically and psychologically devastating, even if the military impact was manageable. The technological evolution of battleships during World War II was remarkable. Radar fire control transformed naval gunnery, allowing ships to engage targets beyond visual range and in conditions of poor visibility. The Battle of North Cape, where the Duke of York detected and engaged the Scharnhorst using radar in Arctic darkness, would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Improved anti-aircraft armament turned battleships into formidable air defense platforms, bristling with dozens of light and medium anti-aircraft guns. Damage control techniques became increasingly sophisticated, allowing ships to survive damage that would have been fatal in earlier conflicts. Yet for all these improvements, the fundamental vulnerability of the battleship was becoming apparent. These enormously expensive vessels required years to build and represented massive investments of resources and industrial capacity. A single battleship might cost as much as hundreds of fighter aircraft and require a crew of over 2,000 highly trained sailors. When a battleship was lost, the impact was enormous, not just tactically, but economically and in terms of human casualties. The Hood's destruction killed more sailors in 3 minutes than many entire campaigns. The loss of trained and experienced personnel was often more difficult to replace than the ship itself. The economic dimension of the battleship in the Atlantic War deserves consideration. Britain and the United States possessed industrial capacities that allowed them to build and maintain large battleship fleets while simultaneously producing vast numbers of other weapons. Germany, by contrast, struggled to complete even a modest battleship construction program while meeting the demands of land and air warfare. The decision to invest heavily in battleships represented a strategic choice with profound implications. Resources devoted to building the Bismarck and Tirpitz might have been used to construct hundreds of U-boats, which proved far more effective at threatening British maritime supremacy. From this perspective, Germany's battleship program can be seen as a strategic error, absorbing resources that might have been employed more effectively elsewhere. The human dimension of battleship warfare was intensely personal, despite the long ranges at which these vessels fought. A battleship crew formed a close-knit community, living and working together in the confined spaces of their steel world. The social hierarchy aboard these ships was rigid, reflecting naval tradition and the demands of military discipline. Officers and enlisted men inhabited separate worlds, though they depended on each other for survival. When a battleship went into action, every member of the crew had a specific role to play, from the admiral on the bridge to the ammunition handlers deep in the magazines. The coordination required to operate these complex machines of war was extraordinary. The experience of combat aboard a battleship was both terrifying and strangely detached. The engagement might take place at ranges of 10 or 15 miles, with the enemy vessel barely visible on the horizon. Yet, when shells arrived, they did so with devastating effect. A single hit could kill dozens of men instantly, start catastrophic fires, or detonate ammunition magazines with apocalyptic force. The survivors of the Hood described a single massive explosion followed by darkness and cold water. Their ship had simply ceased to exist around them. Those who fought aboard the Bismarck during her final battle endured hours of methodical destruction, watching their ship reduced to a burning wreck while unable to escape or surrender effectively. The international dimension of battleship operations in the Atlantic reflected the global nature of World War II. French battleships, after France's defeat in 1940, became pawns in a complex game of naval diplomacy and military necessity. The British attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in July 1940, while tragic, reflected the Admiralty's determination to prevent powerful French battleships from falling into German hands. Italian battleships in the Mediterranean influenced Atlantic operations by tying down British naval forces that might otherwise have been available for Atlantic convoy duty. Even Soviet naval power, limited though it was, played a role in calculations about protecting Arctic convoys. As the war progressed and Allied victory became increasingly certain, the role of battleships evolved once again. By 1944 and 1945, with German surface threats largely eliminated, Allied battleships found employment primarily in supporting amphibious operations and providing naval gunfire support. These missions, while less dramatic than fleet actions, were nonetheless valuable. A battleship's heavy guns could deliver sustained, accurate fire against shore targets, providing support to ground forces that could not be matched by other means. The psychological impact on enemy defenders of being bombarded by 16-inch shells was considerable, and the actual destructive power was immense. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 marked the conclusion of the Atlantic Battleship War, but not the end of the battleship era. Many Allied battleships would cease service in the Pacific during the final months of the war against Japan, and some would remain in service for decades afterward. But the fundamental lesson of World War II was clear. The battleship was no longer the ultimate arbiter of naval power. That role had passed to the aircraft carrier, with its ability to project power over vast distances and strike without exposing itself to direct retaliation. Looking back at the Atlantic Battleship War from the perspective of military history, several key conclusions emerge. First, battleships proved both more capable and more vulnerable than pre-war theorists had anticipated. They could absorb tremendous damage and remain operational, yet they could also be destroyed with shocking suddenness. Second, the psychological and strategic impact of battleships often exceeded their actual tactical contribution. The threat posed by ships like the Tirpitz shaped Allied strategy in ways that went beyond what these vessels actually accomplished. Third, the battleship represented the culmination of a long tradition of naval warfare that was being transformed by new technologies, particularly aviation and submarines. The Atlantic Battleship War was ultimately a contest between different philosophies of naval power. The British and Americans sought to maintain control of the seas through superior numbers and resources, using their battleships as pillars of strength around which other naval forces could organize. The Germans, lacking the industrial capacity to challenge Allied naval dominance directly, attempted to use their battleships as raiders and threats, seeking to disrupt Allied operations rather than achieve decisive victory. Neither approach proved entirely successful, though the Allied strategy ultimately prevailed through sheer weight of resources. The legacy of the Atlantic battleships extends beyond their immediate military impact. These vessels represented a pinnacle of industrial achievement, combining sophisticated engineering, advanced technology, and raw power in a way that captured popular imagination. The dramatic stories of ships like the Hood, the Bismarck, and the Tirpitz have resonated through decades of books, films, and historical studies. The men who served aboard these vessels, whether they survived the war or went down with their ships, became part of a naval tradition that continues to inspire and fascinate. In the final analysis, battleships shaped the Atlantic War not through dominance, but through their influence on strategy, operations, and psychology. They forced both sides to allocate enormous resources to building, maintaining, hunting, or protecting these vessels. They provided capabilities that no other weapon system could match, particularly in terms of sustained heavy fire and the ability to absorb damage. But they also revealed the limitations of traditional naval power in an age of aircraft, submarines, and missiles. The Atlantic Battleship War was thus both a culmination and a conclusion, the last great age of these magnificent but increasingly obsolete weapons.
The Iron Giants of the Atlantic fought their battles in some of the harshest conditions imaginable, from the freezing waters of the Denmark Strait to the storm-tossed North Atlantic. They carried thousands of sailors into battle, young men who served their countries aboard these floating fortresses of steel. Some of these men would survive to tell their stories. Many others would perish in the cold waters of the Atlantic, entombed in their ships or lost to the unforgiving sea. Their sacrifice and the tremendous industrial and military effort represented by the battleships themselves played a crucial role in the Allied victory in World War II. Though the age of the battleship was ending, these vessels wrote the final chapters of their story in letters of fire and steel across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate and inspire more than 3/4 of a century later. The tactical evolution of battleship warfare in the Atlantic reflected rapid adaptation to changing conditions and emerging technologies. When the war began in 1939, naval doctrine still emphasized visual gunnery and traditional fleet actions reminiscent of World War I's Battle of Jutland. By 1943, radar-directed fire control, sophisticated damage control procedures, and integrated air defense systems had transformed how battleships fought. This evolution was driven by harsh experience and the constant pressure of combat, where failure to adapt meant death for ships and crews alike. Radar technology revolutionized battleship operations in ways that extended far beyond improved gunnery. Early in the war, battleships relied on optical rangefinders and visual observation to detect and engage enemy vessels, limiting effective operations to daylight hours and good visibility. The introduction of increasingly sophisticated radar sets allowed battleships to see through darkness, fog, and storm, conditions that frequently prevailed in the North Atlantic. The Duke of York's interception of the Scharnhorst demonstrated the decisive advantage that radar fire control provided. While the German battleship relied primarily on optical systems, the British ship used her Type 284 gunnery radar to detect, track, and engage her target in conditions of Arctic darkness where visual acquisition was nearly impossible. This technological edge proved as important as any advantage in armor or firepower. The integration of battleships into convoy operations revealed another dimension of their strategic value. While submarines posed the greatest threat to merchant shipping, the presence of battleships in convoy escort forces or covering positions provided insurance against surface raiders. The mere knowledge that a convoy might be protected by battleships forced German planners to exercise extreme caution when considering surface attacks. After the Bismarck's destruction, German capital ships became increasingly reluctant to sortie against convoys that might be guarded by equivalent or superior British forces. This deterrent effect multiplied the value of Allied battleships beyond their actual combat contributions. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union represented some of the most challenging operations in which battleships participated. These convoys, designated PQ and QP, later JW and RA, sailed through some of the most hostile waters on Earth, running the gauntlet of German air bases in Norway, U-boat patrol lines, and the constant threat of surface raiders like the Terps.
The distances involved meant that convoys spent days within range of German forces, requiring continuous protection. British battleships formed part of the distant covering forces for these convoys, positioned to intercept German heavy units if they sorted. The presence of these covering forces imposed severe constraints on German operations. Any attack on an Arctic convoy risked a fleet action that Germany could not afford to lose. The strategic calculus surrounding the Tirpitz illustrates the complex economics of battleship warfare. After the Bismarck's loss, Hitler became extremely reluctant to risk Germany's remaining heavy ships, fearing the political and psychological consequences of their destruction. The Tirpitz thus spent most of her career in Norwegian fjords, making only brief sorties, and never engaging in a major surface action. Yet her mere existence forced the Royal Navy to maintain powerful forces in northern waters, diverting ships from the Mediterranean, Pacific, and convoy escort duties. In this sense, the Tirpitz achieved strategic success through inaction, timed down Allied resources far exceeding her own value. The British made extraordinary efforts to destroy her, mounting repeated air attacks, commando raids, and even deploying midget submarines in a desperate attempt to sink her at anchor. The final destruction of the Tirpitz by RAF Lancaster bombers in November 1944 required special tall boys earthquake bombs weighing 12,000 pounds each. Her sinking freed up substantial Allied naval resources for deployment elsewhere. The French battleships added another layer of complexity to the Atlantic naval situation. France possessed powerful modern battleships like Richelieu and Jean Bart, as well as older but still capable vessels like Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Following France's surrender in June 1940, these ships became political and military pawns. The British, fearing that the French fleet might fall into German or Italian hands, took drastic action. At Mers el-Kebir in Algeria, British forces delivered an ultimatum to French Admiral Marcel Bruno-Gensol: join the British, sail to British or neutral ports, or be destroyed. When Gensol refused, British battleships opened fire, sinking or damaging several French ships and killing nearly 1,300 French sailors. This tragic action strained Anglo-French relations, but secured British naval supremacy by ensuring that modern French battleships would not reinforce the Axis fleets. The Richelieu eventually joined the Free French forces and saw action supporting Allied operations, while the Jean Bart, incomplete at Casablanca, fought briefly against American forces during Operation Torch before being neutralized.
The construction and deployment of battleships reflected national industrial capabilities and strategic priorities. Britain, despite facing existential threat, continued building battleships throughout the war, completing vessels like HMS Vanguard, even after it was clear that carriers had become the dominant naval weapon. This investment reflected both institutional inertia and legitimate military requirements. Battleships still provided capabilities that carriers could not match, particularly for shore bombardment and operating in confined waters where carriers were vulnerable. The United States, with its vast industrial capacity, could afford to build both battleships and carriers in enormous numbers, creating a fleet that dominated the oceans by sheer mass. Germany's battleship program revealed the limitations of building powerful individual units without the industrial infrastructure to support them adequately. The Bismarck and Tirpitz were magnificent ships, but Germany lacked the fuel, supplies, and supporting vessels necessary to employ them effectively. After the Bismarck's loss, German battleships operated under severe constraints. They could not risk decisive action because their loss would be irreplaceable. Yet by avoiding risk, they surrendered the initiative to Allied forces. This strategic paralysis was compounded by Hitler's personal intervention in naval operations, as the Führer micromanaged deployments and frequently ordered his ships to avoid combat, further reducing their effectiveness. The human cost of battleship warfare extended beyond those killed in action. The survivors of destroyed battleships often faced harrowing ordeals in the frigid Atlantic waters. When the hood exploded, only 3 men survived from a crew of over 1,400. They were plucked from the water within minutes, yet still suffered from hypothermia and shock. The Bismarck survivors faced worse.
Only 110 men were rescued from over 2,000 crew members. Many of those who made it off the sinking ship died from exposure in the water, while others were left behind when British ships detected a U-boat and were forced to withdraw. The cold waters of the North Atlantic were merciless, killing within minutes even survivors who had escaped the destruction of their ships. Life aboard a battleship combined monotony and terror in equal measure. Most of a sailor's time was spent in routine maintenance, drills, and watches, endless hours of tedious labor keeping the complex machinery operational. The ships were cramped, despite their enormous size, with thousands of men packed into spaces allocated with relentless efficiency. Privacy was non-existent for enlisted men who slept in hammocks or bunks stacked 3 high in mess decks that housed hundreds. The lower decks, where engine room crews and magazine handlers worked, were hot, noisy, and claustrophobic. During action, these spaces became steel coffins if the ship was hit. Men trapped below decks had little chance of escape if their compartments flooded or caught fire. The officer corps of battleships represented the elite of their respective navies. Command of a battleship was a pinnacle of naval achievement, typically awarded to senior captains with extensive experience and proven competence. The admirals who directed battleship operations were often the most distinguished officers in their services. Admiral Bruce Fraser, who commanded the Duke of York when she sank the Scharnhorst, was considered one of the Royal Navy's most capable fighting admirals. Admiral Gunther Lutyens, who went down with the Bismarck, was a veteran officer who had commanded successful operations earlier in the war. These men carried enormous responsibility. Their decisions could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and significantly impact the course of the war. The evolution of anti-aircraft defenses on battleships reflected the growing importance of air power. Early in the war, battleships carried relatively modest anti-aircraft armaments, typically a few heavy anti-aircraft guns supplemented by light automatic weapons. As the war progressed and air attacks became more frequent and sophisticated, anti-aircraft batteries were continually upgraded. By 1943, battleships bristled with dozens of light and medium anti-aircraft guns, creating walls of fire designed to defend against dive bombers, torpedo planes, and level bombers. The effectiveness of these defenses varied considerably. Well-trained crews with modern fire control systems could inflict heavy losses on attacking aircraft, but determined pilots could still penetrate the defenses and score damaging hits. The vulnerability of battleships to air and submarine attack forced the development of sophisticated escort and screening procedures. A battleship operating independently was dangerously exposed. She required destroyers to screen against submarines, cruisers to provide additional firepower and scouting capability, and ideally carrier-based fighters to defend against air attack. The Bismarck's final sortie demonstrated the perils of operating without adequate air cover. Once she was crippled by torpedo bombers from the Ark Royal, she became a sitting target for the British surface forces that finished her off. German battleships operating from Norwegian bases had better access to land-based air cover, but this tied them to operating areas within range of friendly airfields.
The influence of weather on Atlantic battleship operations cannot be overstated. The North Atlantic is one of the most challenging maritime environments on Earth, with frequent storms, heavy seas, and limited visibility. Winter operations were particularly brutal, with temperatures well below freezing, ice accumulating on superstructures, and waves large enough to sweep men overboard. These conditions affected operations in multiple ways. Heavy seas degraded the accuracy of gunfire and made refueling at sea hazardous or impossible. Storms provided cover for raiders trying to evade pursuit, but also limited their ability to locate and attack targets. Aircraft operations became extremely difficult in bad weather, providing windows of opportunity for surface ships, but also limiting reconnaissance and striking capability. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was fought in rough seas that affected gunnery for both sides, while the hunt for the Bismarck was repeatedly complicated by weather that grounded search aircraft. The maintenance and logistical requirements of battleships imposed severe operational constraints. These ships consumed fuel at prodigious rates, requiring frequent refueling that was difficult and dangerous in open ocean conditions. The Bismarck's fuel contamination after being hit by the Prince of Wales proved fatal because it forced Admiral Lütjens to break off his mission and head for France, allowing British forces to concentrate their hunt. Ammunition expenditure was another concern. A battleship might carry hundreds of shells for her main guns, but a major action could exhaust this supply, leaving the ship without her primary armament. Mechanical breakdowns were constant threats. The complex machinery of a battleship required continuous maintenance and repair, often necessitating dockyard facilities that were vulnerable to enemy attack. The question of battleship design philosophy revealed fundamental differences between naval powers. British battleships generally emphasized protection and reliability over maximum firepower, reflecting a defensive mindset shaped by the need to protect far-flung sea lanes. The King George V class mounted 10 14-inch guns rather than the 15-inch or 16-inch weapons carried by many contemporaries, but they had excellent armor protection and proved reliable in service. German battleships, like the Bismarck, emphasized balanced characteristics, good protection, powerful armament, and high speed, but their designs reflected Kriegsmarine requirements for commerce raiding rather than fleet actions. American battleships combined heavy firepower with massive protection, creating vessels that were slower than their German counterparts but nearly impervious to gunfire damage. The final American battleships, the Iowa class, achieved the ideal combination of speed, firepower, and protection, though they saw limited service in the Atlantic. The intelligence war surrounding battleship operations was as important as the shooting war. Both sides devoted enormous resources to tracking enemy capital ships and determining their intentions. The British code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park provided crucial intelligence about German naval operations, though the information was often fragmentary and had to be carefully exploited to avoid revealing that German codes had been compromised. The Bismarck's final sortie was detected early because of signals intelligence, allowing the Royal Navy to position forces to intercept her. Conversely, German intelligence about British ship movements was often inadequate, contributing to operational failures. The Scharnhorst sorted against convoy JW-55B without knowing that the Duke of York was in the area, walking into a trap from which she could not escape. The cultural and symbolic significance of battleships extended far beyond their military function. These ships embodied national power and prestige in a tangible, visible form. When a battleship visited a foreign port, it represented not just naval might, but industrial capability, technological sophistication, and national will. The loss of a battleship was thus more than a military setback. It was a blow to national morale and international prestige. Hitler's obsession with preserving the Tirpitz reflected this understanding. He feared the political consequences of her loss more than the military impact. Churchill's determination to sink the Bismarck similarly reflected the symbolic importance of destroying Germany's most powerful warship. The final years of the war saw battleships increasingly relegated to supporting roles as Allied air and naval superiority grew overwhelming. By 1944, German surface forces were largely confined to port, unable to challenge Allied control of the Atlantic. British and American battleships focused on shore bombardment, supporting amphibious operations, a role where their heavy guns provided unique capabilities. The Normandy invasion saw multiple battleships pounding German fortifications along the coast, their gunfire proving crucial in supporting the landing forces. HMS Warspite, the grand old lady of the Royal Navy who had fought at Jutland in 1916, distinguished herself once again by silencing German batteries that threatened the invasion beaches. Her service spanned nearly 30 decades of naval warfare, from the Dreadnought era through World War II, a testament to the longevity and adaptability of well-designed battleships. The end of the Atlantic War marked the beginning of the end for the battleship as a type. In the immediate post-war years, many battleships were quickly decommissioned and scrapped, their enormous operating costs unjustifiable in peacetime budgets.
Others were modernized and kept in service, finding new roles in Cold War confrontations. Some American Iowa-class battleships saw service in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Persian Gulf, their massive guns still providing valuable fire support decades after their construction. But the era when battleships ruled the seas was over, ended not by a single decisive battle, but by the cumulative weight of technological change and strategic evolution.
The lessons learned from Atlantic battleship operations influenced naval thinking for decades. The importance of air cover for surface forces became axiomatic, driving carrier development and fleet organization. The value of radar and electronic warfare was thoroughly demonstrated, spurring continued technological advancement. The vulnerability of even heavily armored ships to torpedo attack led to improved underwater protection in subsequent designs. Perhaps most importantly, the war demonstrated that numbers and industrial capacity ultimately trumped individual ship superiority. Germany's magnificent but few battleships could not overcome Allied numerical superiority backed by vastly greater industrial production. The environmental cost of battleship warfare, while not recognized at the time, was substantial. The dozens of warships sunk in the Atlantic, including multiple battleships, remain on the ocean floor as war graves and environmental hazards. The Bismarck lies in over 15,000 feet of water, her hull slowly corroding but largely intact. The Hood's wreck was located in deep water, a somber monument to the 1,415 men who died with her. These wrecks contain thousands of tons of fuel oil, ammunition, and other materials that continue to leak into the ocean decades later. They serve as underwater museums and graveyards, protected sites that remind us of the terrible cost of naval warfare. The strategic bombing campaign against German naval facilities represented another front in the battleship war. Allied bombers repeatedly attacked German ports and shipyards, attempting to destroy or damage capital ships in port and disrupt construction of new vessels. The Tirpitz was subjected to numerous bombing raids while anchored in Norwegian fjords, though early attacks achieved limited success due to the difficulty of hitting a ship protected by anti-aircraft defenses, smokescreens, and torpedo nets. Only the development of specialized weapons like the tallboy bomb made it possible to sink her at anchor. These attacks reflected the growing capability of air power to threaten even the most heavily protected surface vessels. The international repercussions of Atlantic battleship operations extended into the post-war world. The Cold War naval balance was shaped partly by lessons learned during World War II. The Soviet Union, which possessed only limited naval forces during the war, embarked on an ambitious naval construction program afterward, though focusing more on submarines and missile-armed vessels than traditional battleships. The United States maintained the world's most powerful navy, centered on aircraft carriers but including modernized battleships as supplementary units. Britain, economically exhausted by the war, could no longer afford to maintain its traditional naval supremacy and gradually reduced its battle fleet. The age of Pax Britannica, enforced by British battleships for over a century, had definitively ended. The memories and legends of Atlantic battleship combat have inspired countless works of history, fiction, and film. The hunt for the Bismarck has been retold in multiple books and movies, capturing popular imagination with its drama of pursuit and destruction. The Hood's loss remains one of the most shocking disasters in naval history, studied by military historians and mourned by those with connections to the lost crew. The Tirpitz's career as a fleet in being and her eventual destruction by specialized bombs has fascinated students of naval strategy. These stories resonate because they combine human drama, technological sophistication, and strategic significance in narratives that remain compelling decades after the events. The archaeology of sunken battleships has provided new insights into these vessels and their final moments. Deep-sea exploration of the Bismarck's wreck revealed details about her construction and the damage she sustained during her final battle. The discovery that her hull was largely intact suggested that she had been scuttled by her crew rather than sunk purely by British gunfire, though debate continues among historians. Expeditions to the Hood's wreck have attempted to determine exactly what caused her catastrophic explosion, examining the scattered remains for clues about the fatal hit. These underwater investigations combine historical research with advanced technology, bringing new understanding to events long shrouded in uncertainty.
The personal stories of battleship sailors revealed the human reality behind the statistics and strategic analyses. Many men who served aboard these vessels were teenagers, joining the Navy straight from school and thrust into a world of strict discipline, hard work, and constant danger. They formed close bonds with their shipmates, relationships forged through shared hardship and the knowledge that they depended on each other for survival. The loss of their ships meant not just military defeat, but the destruction of communities and the death of friends. Survivors often struggled with guilt and trauma, haunted by memories of shipmates who did not escape. The 3 survivors of the Hood, plucked from the water by a destroyer, spent the rest of their lives wondering why they lived when so many others died. The technical sophistication of late-war battleships represented the pinnacle of pre-atomic naval engineering. These vessels incorporated advanced metallurgy, sophisticated fire control systems, powerful propulsion plants, and complex damage control arrangements. The amount of copper wiring in the single battleship measured in miles. The fire control computers, though primitive by modern standards, were marvels of mechanical engineering. The construction of a battleship required coordinating thousands of workers across hundreds of contractors and subcontractors, producing everything from massive gun barrels to delicate electrical components. The industrial mobilization necessary to build these vessels was itself a strategic achievement of the First Order.
As we look back across more than 8 decades to the Atlantic Battleship War, we see a conflict that marked both the zenith and the twilight of a particular form of naval warfare. The battleships that fought in the Atlantic were the most powerful warships ever built for that theater, embodying centuries of naval tradition and decades of technological development. They fought in some of the most dramatic naval actions in history, from the Denmark Strait to the North Cape, writing the final chapters in the story of the gun-armed capital ship. Their influence extended far beyond their actual combat achievements, shaping strategy, absorbing resources, and capturing imaginations. The Iron Giants of the Atlantic ultimately proved to be magnificent anachronisms, superbly effective at a form of warfare that was rapidly becoming obsolete. They could still accomplish missions that no other weapon system could match, but they required enormous resources to build and operate, and they were vulnerable to threats that they could not effectively counter. The future belonged to carriers, submarines, and eventually missiles. But the battleships of World War II represented the apex of a tradition that stretched back to the age of sail. They were the last of their kind, and their story remains one of the most compelling chapters in naval history.